The blazing Arizona sun left no soul untouched as Madeline Hayes wiped her brow with the back of her dusty hand. Her eyes fixed determinedly on the towering fence post that refused to budge despite her best efforts. The year was 1885, and Bisbee was no place for the faint of heart, especially not for a woman trying to save her late father's ranch from ruin. "For heaven's sake, Miss Hayes, step aside before you hurt yourself," barked Frank Donnelly, the ranch foreman her father had hired shortly before his passing 3 months ago. His weathered face contorted into a scowl as he stomped across the dusty yard. "This is men's work. I told your father hiring a woman would be trouble, and now I'm telling you the same." Madeline gripped the fence post tighter, her knuckles turning white. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Donnelly, but this is my ranch now and I intend to work it." "Your ranch?" Frank laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and drawing the attention of the other ranch hands. "Your father would be rolling in his grave seeing his precious rocking H being run by a woman who can't even set a post straight. You're not strong enough, and you never will be." A shadow fell across them both, and Madeline looked up to see Xavier Irwin, a cowboy who'd arrived looking for work just 2 weeks prior. His tall frame blocked the sun as he stood silently observing the confrontation, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. "Something to add, Irwin?" Frank challenged, turning his ire toward the quiet cowboy. Xavier's eyes, a striking blue against his sun-bronzed skin, shifted to Madeline before returning to the foreman. "Just that you might want to reconsider, Frank." His voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge. "She's stronger than all of us." Frank's face flushed red. "Is that so? Well, we'll see how strong she is when this ranch fails by Christmas." He spat on the ground between them and stormed off, leaving Madeline and Xavier alone by the stubborn fence post. "You didn't have to do that," Madeline said softly, pushing a strand of copper hair that had escaped her practical braid back behind her ear. "I can fight my own battles." Xavier nodded, his expression serious. "I know you can, Miss Hayes. That's exactly why I said it." Their eyes met for a long moment, and something flickered in the air between them, something neither of them was prepared to acknowledge. "Not yet." "Well," Madeline broke the silence, turning back to the fence post. "Since you seem so confident in my abilities, Mr. Irwin, perhaps you'd care to show me the proper technique for setting this post. I'm willing to learn, not just prove a point." The corner of Xavier's mouth twitched upward. "It would be my pleasure, Miss Hayes." As they worked side by side under the relentless Arizona sun, neither could have predicted how their lives would become irrevocably entangled in the months to come, nor the challenges they would face together on the unforgiving frontier of Bisbee, Arizona. The days that followed were no easier for Madeline. Each morning, she rose before dawn, her body aching from the previous day's labor. Her hands, once smooth and unmarred, now bore calluses and small cuts, badges of honor in her mind, though she knew the ladies in town would view them differently. 1 week after the confrontation with Frank, Madeline sat at her father's desk, now reviewing the ranch's finances with growing concern. The rocking H was bleeding money, and without the fall cattle drive being successful, they wouldn't survive the winter. A knock at the study door pulled her from her troubling thoughts. "Enter," she called, quickly wiping away a stray tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. Xavier stepped into the room, removing his hat in one fluid motion. "Pardon the interruption, Miss Hayes. The men are asking about the drive route. Frank's saying we should take the eastern trail to Tucson, but that would add 3 days to our journey," Madeline finished, standing up. "No, we'll take the western pass. It's more difficult terrain, but we'll reach the buyers faster." Xavier studied her face. "Frank won't like that decision." Frank doesn't have to like it. I'm paying his wages. Madeline walked around the desk, gathering the ledger in her arms. Would you mind calling the men together? I'd like to discuss the preparations myself. Xavier nodded but hesitated at the door. Miss Hayes, if I may. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The men respect actions more than words. If you're going on this drive, Madeline arched an eyebrow. There's no if, Mr. Irwin. I am most certainly going on this drive. Then you'll need to show them you can ride and rope as well as any of them, Xavier continued, undeterred by her interruption. Some of the men have never worked for a woman before. They're uncertain. Madeline's shoulders straightened. Then I suppose it's time to remove that uncertainty. I'll meet you in the corral in 10 minutes. True to her word, Madeline appeared at the corral precisely 10 minutes later, having changed into more practical riding attire. The ranch hands gathered around as she mounted her father's favorite horse, a spirited chestnut gelding named Rusty. Gentlemen, she addressed the assembled men, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. Some of you have expressed concerns about my ability to lead this ranch. That ends today. Without further preamble, she urged Rusty into motion, guiding him through a series of complicated maneuvers that her father had taught her since childhood. She then called for a rope, and with practiced precision, demonstrated her roping skills on a wooden practice steer. When she finished, silence hung over the corral. Madeline dismounted, patting Rusty's neck as she faced her audience, her gaze settling on Frank's thunderous expression. The western pass to Tucson, she announced clearly. We leave in 3 days. Any man who doesn't want to ride under my leadership is free to collect his wages and go. No one moved. Xavier stepped forward, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. I believe that settles it, Miss Hayes. We'll be ready to ride. As the men dispersed, Frank lingered, his eyes narrowed. Pretty tricks won't save you out on the trail, he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The first storm or bandit attack, and we'll see what you're really made of. I suppose we will, Mr. Donnelly, Madeline replied evenly. I suppose we will. That evening, Madeline sat on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and deep purples. The beauty of the Arizona landscape still took her breath away, even after 22 years of calling it home. The sound of boots on the wooden steps alerted her to Xavier's presence before he spoke. Mind if I join you, Miss Hayes? Please, she gestured to the empty chair beside her. And I think, given the circumstances, you might as well call me Madeline. Miss Hayes feels rather formal for trail companions. Xavier sat, placing his hat on his knee. Madeline, then, and I'm Xavier to my friends. Are we friends, Mr. Irwin? She asked, glancing at him sideways. His eyes met hers, serious but with warmth behind them. I'd like to think we're becoming so. Madeline smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in days. Very well, Xavier. Friends it is. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Xavier spoke again. Your father taught you well. Those riding skills impressed even the most skeptical men today. He wanted me prepared for anything, Madeline said softly, memories of her father washing over her. After my mother died when I was 12, it was just the two of us. He said a woman in the West needed to be twice as capable as any man to get half the respect. He was a wise man. He was, she agreed, her voice catching slightly. But even he couldn't have prepared me for this, running the entire ranch, fighting to keep his dream alive. She trailed off, embarrassed by her sudden vulnerability. Xavier's voice was gentle when he replied. You don't have to do it alone, you know. There are people here who want to help, who believe in you. People like you, Madeline asked, meeting his gaze directly. Yes, Xavier answered simply. People like me. The honesty in his eyes was almost too much to bear, and Madeline looked away back to the fading sunset. "Thank you for standing up to Frank today, and the other day." "Frank's a good foreman in many ways," Xavier acknowledged, "but he's set in his thinking. He can't see that the world is changing. Women like you are changing it." Madeline laughed softly. "I'm not trying to change the world, Xavier. I'm just trying to save my ranch." "Sometimes those end up being the same thing," he replied with a small smile. As darkness fell completely and the stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky, they continued talking, sharing stories of their pasts. Madeline learned that Xavier had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, seeking adventure and a fresh start after losing his parents to influenza. He'd worked on ranches throughout the territory, picking up skills and experience along the way. "What made you stop here?" Madeline asked, curious about the man who had so quickly become her ally. Xavier was quiet for a moment, as if considering his answer carefully. "I've been moving from place to place for 5 years, never staying more than a season or two. I rode into Bisbee looking for work, nothing more, but something about this place." He paused, his eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. "Something told me I needed to stay." The intensity of his gaze made Madeline's heart quicken, and she found herself unable to look away. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Xavier broke the silence, standing and placing his hat back on his head. "It's getting late, and we both have an early start tomorrow. Good night, Madeline." "Good night, Xavier," she replied softly, watching as he descended the porch steps and disappeared into the darkness toward the bunkhouse. Alone again, Madeline hugged her arms around herself, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. There was no time for such feelings, she reminded herself sternly. The ranch had to come first. Everything else was a luxury she couldn't afford, not now, perhaps not ever. Yet as she rose to go inside, she couldn't help but glance once more in the direction Xavier had gone, wondering what it might be like to have someone truly by her side in this fight. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation for the cattle drive. Madeline worked alongside the men, checking supplies, inspecting the herd, and finalizing the route. Frank continued to voice his objections to her plans at every opportunity, but she stood firm, earning grudging respect from even the most doubtful ranch hands. On the evening before their departure, Madeline visited town to settle accounts with the local merchants and to speak with her father's old friend, Samuel Wilson, who owned the bank. "You're taking a considerable risk with this drive, Madeline," Samuel said as they sat in his office. "The Western Pass is dangerous this time of year. Flash floods, bandits, not to mention the Apache who have been seen in that area. The eastern route would take too long," Madeline explained. "We need to reach the buyers quickly if we're going to get a fair price." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying her with concern. "Your father was a good friend, and I promised him I'd look out for you. He'd be worried sick knowing you were going on this drive yourself." "My father taught me everything I know about ranching," Madeline countered. "He'd expect me to do whatever necessary to save the rocking H." "Perhaps," Samuel conceded, "but he'd also want you safe. I understand Frank Donnelly has suggested you stay behind and let him lead the drive." Madeline's eyes narrowed. "Has Frank been to see you?" Samuel had the grace to look uncomfortable. "He came by yesterday. He's concerned about your inexperience." "I see." Madeline stood, smoothing her skirts. "Well, Mr. Wilson, while I appreciate both your and Mr. Donnelly's concern, my decision is final. I will be leading the drive, and we leave at dawn tomorrow. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations to complete." As she exited the bank, Madeline's composure nearly crumbled. Frank going behind her back to speak with Samuel was a betrayal she hadn't anticipated. If he was willing to do that, what else might he do to undermine her authority? Lost in these troubling thoughts, she didn't notice the group of men lounging outside the saloon until one called out to her. "Well, if it isn't the lady rancher," a slurred voice jeered. "Heard you're playing cowboy now, Miss Hayes." Madeline kept walking, her head held high, but the men pushed off from the porch and moved to block her path. There were 3 of them, all vaguely familiar as troublemakers who occasionally worked seasonal jobs around Bisbee. "Ain't polite to ignore a friendly greeting," said the tallest one, stepping directly in front of her. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I need to pass," Madeline said firmly, though her heart pounded in her chest. "We heard you're taking a herd through the Western Pass," another man said, circling around her. "Pretty dangerous for a little lady. Maybe you need some real men to help you." "I have all the help I need, thank you," Madeline replied, trying to step around them. The tall one grabbed her arm. "Now don't be hasty. Take your hand off the lady," came a steely voice from behind them. Madeline turned to see Xavier standing there, his stance casual but his eyes hard as flint. He wasn't alone. 2 more of her ranch hands flanked him. "This ain't your business, Irwin," the man holding Madeline's arm growled, though he loosened his grip slightly. "Miss Hayes is my employer, which makes her safety very much my business," Xavier replied evenly. "Now I won't ask again." A tense moment passed before the drunk man released Madeline's arm, backing away with a forced laugh. "Just having a friendly conversation. No harm done." "Then you won't mind continuing your friendly conversation elsewhere," Xavier suggested, his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. The men slouched off, muttering curses under their breath. Once they were out of earshot, Madeline let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Xavier. And you too, Tom, Bill," she acknowledged the other ranch hands. "We were just picking up the last supplies when we saw those troublemakers eyeing you," Tom explained. "Xavier thought we should check on you." Madeline smiled gratefully. "Good instincts. I appreciate it." After the other men excused themselves to finish their errands, Xavier offered to escort Madeline back to the ranch. As they walked toward where their horses were hitched, he asked, "Everything go all right at the bank?" Madeline hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "Not exactly. It seems Frank has been speaking to Mr. Wilson about my inexperience and suggesting he should lead the drive instead of me." Xavier's expression darkened. "That crosses a line." "It does," Madeline agreed, "but I'm not surprised. Frank never wanted to work for me in the first place. He stayed out of loyalty to my father's memory, nothing more." "What will you do?" Madeline sighed, untying her horse's reins. "What can I do? I need him for this drive. Good foremen are hard to come by, and most of the men respect him. I'll deal with his insubordination after we return, assuming he doesn't make any more attempts to undermine me." Xavier helped her mount, his hands strong and steady as he assisted her. "I'll keep an eye on him," he promised, his voice low, "if he tries anything else." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Madeline replied, though the warmth of his protective gesture lingered even as they rode back to the ranch. The night before the drive, sleep eluded Madeline. She paced her bedroom, going over mental checklists and worrying about all the things that could go wrong. Her father had taken her on shorter drives when she was younger, but she'd never been responsible for one of this magnitude before. 40 ranch hands, nearly 2,000 head of cattle, and a journey that would take them at least 2 weeks through some of the most challenging terrains in the territory. And then there was Frank, whose loyalty she could no longer count on. What if he deliberately sabotaged the drive? What if the men sided with him over her when they were far from the ranch? A soft knock at her bedroom window startled her from these dark thoughts. Pulling back the curtain, she was shocked to see Xavier standing in the yard below, gesturing for her to come down. Curiosity overcame propriety, and Madeline quickly pulled on a shawl over her nightgown and made her way downstairs and out onto the porch. "Xavier, what are you doing here at this hour?" she whispered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I saw the light in your window," he explained. "Couldn't sleep either," she shook her head. "Too much on my mind." "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. "I want to show you something." Madeline hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The impropriety of the situation wasn't lost on her, but something about Xavier inspired trust that overrode conventional concerns. He led her to the highest point on the ranch property, a small rise that offered a clear view of the sprawling land below, silvered by moonlight. "My father used to bring me here before every drive," Xavier explained as they stood side by side. "He said seeing the land from above helped put things in perspective." Madeline took in the view the ranch buildings, the corrals where the cattle were gathered, the distant mountains they would navigate in the coming days. "It's beautiful." "Your father built something remarkable here," Xavier said softly. "And you're going to keep it going, no matter what Frank or anyone else says." Madeline turned to look at him, struck by the conviction in his voice. "How can you be so sure? You barely know me." Xavier met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I know enough. I've watched you these past weeks, Madeline. I've seen how you work harder than anyone, how you learn and adapt, how you refuse to give up even when it would be easier to sell the ranch and live comfortably in town." His words wrapped around her like a blanket, warming her from the inside out. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered. Xavier stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him in the cool night air. "There's something between us, Madeline. I think we both know it." Her breath caught in her throat. "Xavier, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "Now's not the time with everything else you're facing. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens on this drive, whatever Frank tries, you're not alone. I'm with you." Madeline felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by his quiet declaration of support. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to close the distance between them, to discover if his lips were as warm as they looked, to lose herself in the comfort of his embrace. Instead, she nodded, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "Thank you." They stood there a moment longer, the unspoken possibility hanging in the air between them before Xavier reluctantly stepped back. "We should get some rest," he said. "Dawn comes early." As they walked back to the ranch house in silence, their hands occasionally brushing against each other, Madeline felt a curious lightness in her chest, despite the challenges that awaited her. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel completely alone. The morning of the drive dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of heat to come as the sun rose higher. Madeline, dressed in practical riding clothes with her hair braided securely, mounted her horse and surveyed the organized chaos before her. Ranch hands moved efficiently among the gathered cattle, their shouts and whistles directing the herd toward the starting point. Dust rose in clouds, mingling with the earthy smell of the animals and the sweet scent of the sage that dotted the landscape. Frank approached on horseback, his expression closed as he tipped his hat in grudging acknowledgement. "The men are ready, Miss Hayes. We can move out on your order." "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly," Madeline replied formally. "Please inform the men we'll depart in 15 minutes." As Frank rode away, Xavier appeared beside her, looking fresh despite the early hour. "Beautiful morning for a drive," he commented, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Let's hope it stays that way," Madeline responded, anxiety and excitement warring within her. "The weather can turn quickly in the pass." Xavier nodded in agreement. "We'll post extra lookouts when we reach the narrower sections. Tom and Bill are experienced with that terrain. They'll know the signs of trouble." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Garcia, the housekeeper who would look after the main house during their absence. The older woman handed Madeline a small package wrapped in cloth. "Biscuits and dried fruit for your saddlebag, Miss Madeline," she said with a warm smile. "And a little something extra for luck." Madeline unwrapped the bundle to find a small silver charm in the shape of a horseshoe nestled among the food. "Oh, Mrs. Garcia, it's lovely. Thank you. My Carlos wore it on every drive for 30 years, the older woman explained, referring to her late husband who had worked on the rocking H until his passing. "Never lost a steer or a man. I think he would want you to have it now." Touched by the gesture, Madeline carefully pinned the charm to her shirt. "I'll treasure it." At precisely 6 o'clock, Madeline gave the signal to move out. The lead riders nudged the front of the herd into motion, and the drive began, a living river of cattle flowing across the Arizona landscape toward the distant market in Tucson. For the first 3 days, the journey proceeded smoothly. Madeline rode alongside different groups of men, listening to their stories, learning from their experience, and gradually earning their respect. Even Frank seemed to have accepted her leadership, offering advice when asked and executing her instructions without complaint. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they made camp at the entrance to the Western Pass, Madeline sat beside the campfire, studying her father's maps while the men ate their supper and settled the herd for the night. "Mind if I join you?" Xavier asked, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. Madeline smiled, accepting the offered cup gratefully. "Please do. I was just looking at tomorrow's route. The pass narrows considerably about 5 miles in." Xavier settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I scouted ahead a bit this afternoon. The trail is clear, but there are signs of recent rainfall. We'll need to watch for loose rocks." They discussed the route in detail, their heads bent together over the maps, occasionally looking up to find the other's gaze lingering. The firelight cast a warm glow over Xavier's features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intelligence in his eyes. Across the fire, Frank watched their interaction with growing displeasure, his fingers drumming impatiently against his knee. When one of the younger ranch hands made a joke that caused Madeline to laugh and touch Xavier's arm briefly, Frank abruptly stood and walked away from the camp. "He doesn't like seeing us together," Madeline observed quietly after Frank had gone. Xavier's expression remained neutral. "Frank has his own ideas about how things should be. Your friendship with me doesn't fit his vision." "Is that what this is? Friendship?" Madeline asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Xavier's eyes met hers, the intensity in them making her breath catch. "You know it's more than that, Madeline." Before she could respond, shouts erupted from the edge of camp. Both jumped to their feet as one of the night guards came running toward them. "Riders approaching from the east," the man called. "At least 6 of them, moving fast." Xavier immediately took charge. "Get the men into defensive positions. Miss Hayes, stay close to me." The camp burst into activity as men grabbed rifles and took cover behind wagons and rocks. Madeline retrieved her own rifle from her saddlebags, her heart pounding but her hands steady as she checked that it was loaded. "Could be nothing," Xavier said as they crouched behind a wagon. "Travelers or another ranch crew. At this hour, moving fast toward a cattle camp." "Unlikely," Madeline replied grimly. Her suspicion proved correct when the approaching riders began firing before they were fully visible, bullets splintering wood and sending men diving for better cover. "Rustlers," Frank's voice rang out from somewhere to their left. "Protect the herd." The next few minutes were chaos as the ranch hands returned fire, the night filled with gunshots and shouting. Xavier stayed at Madeline's side, his presence both protective and reassuring as they defended their position. Through the dust and darkness, Madeline counted only 5 attackers, not the 6 initially reported. A prickle of unease ran down her spine as she realized one might have circled around behind them. Her instinct proved correct when a rough hand suddenly clamped over her mouth and an arm wrapped around her waist, dragging her backward away from Xavier, who was focused on the main attack. Madeline fought against her captor, kicking and twisting with all her strength. She managed to wrench her head free enough to shout, "Xavier!" Before the hand covered her mouth again, Xavier turned just in time to see Madeline being dragged into the darkness by a masked figure. Without hesitation, he sprinted after them, shouting for the other men to continue defending the herd. The rustler pulled Madeline toward a waiting horse, but her resistance slowed him down enough that Xavier was able to close the distance. With a flying tackle, he brought both the attacker and Madeline to the ground. In the ensuing struggle, the rustler pulled a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight as he slashed wildly. Xavier dodged the first attack, but wasn't quick enough to avoid the second. The knife caught him across the arm, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. Madeline, seeing Xavier wounded, acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a rock from the ground and struck the rustler hard on the back of the head. The man crumpled instantly, unconscious. "Xavier!" Madeline scrambled to his side, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wounded arm. "How bad is it?" "Just a scratch," he assured her, though the bloodstain spreading across his sleeve suggested otherwise. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her hands trembling as she tied the makeshift bandage. "No, thanks to you." Their eyes met in the darkness, relief and something deeper passing between them. Without thinking, Madeline leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief but heartfelt kiss born of fear and gratitude and the feelings that had been building between them for weeks. When she pulled back, Xavier's expression was a mixture of surprise and tenderness. "Madeline." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them as several ranch hands arrived, Frank at the lead. "Miss Hayes, are you all right?" Frank called, his voice tight with what seemed like genuine concern. "We're fine," Madeline answered, helping Xavier to his feet. "Mr. Irwin is injured, though. He saved me from this one." She gestured to the unconscious rustler. Frank's eyes narrowed as he took in their closeness, the bandage on Xavier's arm and the undeniable intimacy of their stance. His jaw tightened, but he merely nodded and instructed 2 of the men to secure the rustler. "The others ran off when they realized we were well armed," he reported. "They got away with a few head of cattle, nothing more." "Good work, Mr. Donnelly," Madeline acknowledged. "Please see that the men get back to their posts. We'll need extra vigilance tonight in case they return." As Frank and the others moved away, Madeline turned back to Xavier. "You need proper medical attention." "It can wait until morning," he insisted, though his face was pale in the moonlight. "It most certainly cannot," Madeline countered, leading him firmly toward her tent where she kept medical supplies. "I won't have you bleeding all night because of your stubborn pride." A ghost of a smile crossed Xavier's face. "Speaking of stubborn." Inside her tent, Madeline lit a lamp and instructed Xavier to remove his shirt so she could clean and bandage the wound properly. The cut was deeper than he'd admitted, a 4-inch gash across his upper arm that would likely leave a scar. As she worked, her fingers gentle on his skin, neither mentioned the kiss they had shared in the darkness. Yet it hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that could no longer be ignored. "Why did you come to the rocking, Xavier?" Madeline asked suddenly, her eyes focused on tying the bandage securely. The real reason. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, watching her face in the lamplight. I heard in town that Jonathan Hayes had died and his daughter was trying to run the ranch alone. People were taking bets on how quickly you'd fail. Madeline's hands stilled. And you wanted to see the spectacle for yourself. No, Xavier shook his head emphatically. I wanted to help. My own father lost everything because no one would give him a fair chance after my mother died. Everyone said a man alone couldn't run a farm and raise a child. His voice softened. When I heard about you, I thought perhaps I could make a difference this time. Madeline met his gaze, her heart aching at the sincerity in his eyes. You have, she whispered, more than you know. The air between them thickened with unspoken words and desires. Xavier reached up with his uninjured arm, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Madeline, he began, his voice rough with emotion. What happened out there, I'm not sorry, she interrupted, summoning her courage. I know it was impulsive and perhaps improper, but I'm not sorry. A slow smile spread across Xavier's face, transforming his features. Good, he murmured, leaning closer. Because neither am I. This time, their kiss was deliberate and unhurried, a proper exploration rather than a desperate reaction. Xavier's hand cradled her face gently as his lips moved against hers, and Madeline felt herself melting into his touch, her heart racing with emotions too complex to name. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier pressed his forehead against hers. I should go, he said reluctantly, before someone comes looking for us and finds me half-dressed in your tent. Madeline laughed softly, though she knew he was right. Her reputation was precarious enough as a woman running a ranch. A scandal would only make her position more difficult. Thank you, she said as he pulled his torn shirt back on, for saving my life, for believing in me, for everything. Xavier paused at the tent entrance, his silhouette outlined against the night sky. Get some rest, Madeline. Tomorrow will be challenging. As he disappeared into the darkness, Madeline touched her fingers to her lips, still warm from his kiss. Despite the attack, despite the dangers that lay ahead, she felt a hope blooming inside her that had nothing to do with cattle prices or the success of the drive. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than just survival. The next morning dawned gray and ominous, with heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The camp was subdued as the men tended to the cattle and prepared to move out, the previous night's attack leaving everyone on edge. Their captive rustler had provided little information beyond confirming they were a small band operating independently, not part of a larger gang. Frank had decided to keep him bound in one of the supply wagons until they could deliver him to the authorities in Tucson. As the drive resumed, Madeline found herself repeatedly glancing at Xavier, who rode near the front of the herd despite his injury. Whenever their eyes met, a small, private smile passed between them, a reminder of what they had shared and the promise of what might come. Frank, however, seemed increasingly agitated as the day progressed. He barked orders at the younger hands, criticized minor mistakes, and deliberately positioned himself between Madeline and Xavier whenever possible. By midday, they had reached the narrowest part of the pass, where sheer rock walls rose on either side of the trail, leaving barely enough room for the cattle to move through three abreast. The threatening sky had made good on its promise and rain fell steadily, turning the path muddy and treacherous. We need to push through before it gets worse, Frank insisted as they paused to assess the situation. If this rain continues, the whole pass could flood. Madeline studied the steep walls, noting how the rain was already creating small rivulets that cascaded down the rocks. It's too risky to rush. The cattle could panic in these close quarters, especially with the rain and the noise of water. "With all due respect, Miss Hayes," Frank's tone suggested he felt no respect at all. "I've been through this pass a dozen times. If we don't move quickly, we could lose the entire herd." Xavier rode up beside them, his hat pulled low against the rain. "Frank's right about the flood risk, but Madeline's right about rushing being dangerous. We should send scouts ahead to make sure the path remains clear, and move at a steady pace, not a rush." Frank's eyes narrowed at Xavier's use of Madeline's first name. "Since when are you the expert on this territory, Irwin? You've been in Arizona, a few years? I've been working these trails since before you were out of short pants." "Enough," Madeline cut in firmly. "We'll proceed with caution. Mr. Donnelly, please select 2 men to ride ahead and check the conditions. Mr. Irwin, organize the hands to keep the cattle moving steadily without crowding." Both men nodded stiffly and moved to execute her orders, though the tension between them remained palpable. For the next hour, they made slow but steady progress through the pass. The rain intensified, and the sound of water rushing somewhere ahead grew louder, setting the cattle and horses on edge. Suddenly, one of the scouts came galloping back, his face grim beneath his rain-soaked hat. "Flash flood coming down from the North Fork," he shouted. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before it hits this section." Madeline's mind raced as she assessed their position. They were too deep in the pass to retreat, and not close enough to the exit to outrun the flood. "We need higher ground," she called to Xavier and Frank, who had ridden to her side at the scout's warning. Frank pointed to a narrow trail that branched off the main pass, climbing steeply up the rock face. "That leads to a plateau about 50 feet up. It's our only chance." "Can we get the entire herd up there in time?" Madeline asked doubtfully, eyeing the narrow path. Frank shook his head. "Not the cattle. We'll have to let them go and hope some survive, but we can save the men and horses." "No," Madeline's voice was firm. "We didn't come all this way to lose the herd. There has to be another option." Xavier studied the pass ahead, his expression thoughtful despite the urgency. "There's a wider section about a quarter-mile ahead where the walls aren't as steep. If we can get the cattle there, they'll have a better chance of riding out the flood." "That's suicide," Frank argued. "We'd have to drive them directly toward the flood." "Not if we hurry," Xavier countered. "The scout said 10 minutes. If we push hard, we can reach the wider section before the water hits." Madeline made her decision. "We try for the wider section. Any man who wants to take the high trail is free to do so, no one will think less of him." To her relief, not a single hand broke ranks. With renewed determination, they urged the herd forward at the fastest safe pace, the cattle sensing the humans' urgency and responding to it. The rain became a deluge, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Madeline rode alongside her men, shouting encouragement and helping to keep the cattle moving in the right direction. Xavier stayed close to her left, while Frank took position on her right, their personal animosity temporarily set aside in the face of the common threat. Just as they reached the wider section Xavier had described, a roaring sound filled the pass, drowning out even the lowing of the frightened cattle. Madeline looked back to see a wall of water surging toward them, carrying debris and churning with frightening power. "Get to the sides," she shouted, gesturing wildly to her men. Higher ground. Now, in the chaos that followed, ranch hands scrambled to reach the less steep slopes at the edges of the widened pass, pulling their mounts up after them. The cattle, panicked by the approaching flood, bunched tightly together, their mass actually providing some stability as the water hit. Madeline had just reached a rocky outcropping when she heard a shout of alarm. Turning, She saw one of the youngest hands, barely 18, slip from his spooked horse and fall directly into the path of the oncoming water. Without hesitation, she wheeled her horse around and charged back down the slope. Reaching the fallen boy just seconds before the flood, she extended her arm, grasping his hand and pulling with all her strength to swing him up behind her. They almost made it. The leading edge of the flood caught them just as they turned back toward safety, the force of it nearly sweeping them away. Madeline's horse, a steady animal with years of experience, fought against the current, struggling toward the higher ground where Xavier was shouting her name, his face contorted with fear. Just when it seemed they might be lost, Frank appeared beside them, having ridden back into danger. He grabbed Madeline's horse's bridle, adding his strength to guide them through the rushing water toward safety. Together, they managed to reach the slope where Xavier waited. He pulled the young hand from Madeline's horse first, then reached for her, his strong arms lifting her from the saddle and holding her tightly once she was on solid ground. "Don't ever do that again," he whispered fiercely into her hair, his voice shaking. "I thought I'd lost you." Madeline clung to him, too overwhelmed to speak, the reality of how close she had come to death washing over her with more force than the flood. Frank, having ensured Madeline's horse was also safely on higher ground, approached them, water streaming from his clothes and hat. His expression as he looked at Madeline in Xavier's embrace was unreadable. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said finally, his gruff voice barely audible over the roar of the water. Madeline pulled back slightly from Xavier, though she remained within the circle of his arms. "Thank you for coming after us, Mr. Donnelly. You saved our lives." Frank nodded once, his eyes moving from Madeline to Xavier and back again. Something in his gaze shifted, a resignation or perhaps a realization settling in. Without another word, he turned and walked away to check on the rest of the men. As the flood waters raged below them, transforming the pass into a churning river, Madeline surveyed her men and what remained of the herd. Miraculously, they had lost only a few dozen cattle, far fewer than might have been expected in such a catastrophe. "You did it," Xavier said softly, following her gaze. "You saved the drive." Madeline shook her head. "We did it, all of us together." She turned to look at him directly, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "I couldn't have done it without you, Xavier." His eyes, warm despite the cold rain that still fell around them, held hers. "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." In that moment, surrounded by danger but secure in the knowledge that they had faced it together, Madeline acknowledged to herself what she had been feeling since Xavier first stood up for her against Frank. This was more than gratitude or physical attraction. This was something deeper, something that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. It was love, blooming improbably in the harshest of circumstances. The flood waters receded almost as quickly as they had risen, though the pass remained muddy and treacherous. After ensuring everyone was accounted for and attending to minor injuries, Madeline called a council with Xavier, Frank, and the most experienced hands to determine their next move. "The pass ahead will be dangerous for at least a day," Frank advised, his manner more respectful than it had been since her father died. "I suggest we make camp here and wait for better conditions." "We're already behind schedule," one of the older hands pointed out. "The buyers in Tucson won't wait forever." Madeline considered her options carefully. "What's the alternative route from here?" "We could backtrack about 5 miles and take the northern fork," Xavier suggested. "It's longer but higher ground, less risk of another flood but rougher terrain." Frank nodded grudgingly. "Irwin's right about that. It would add 2 days to the journey but might be safer overall." Madeline made her decision. We'll rest here tonight and assess the pass in the morning. If conditions haven't improved significantly, we'll take the northern fork. As the men dispersed to set up a makeshift camp on the elevated ground, Frank lingered, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Hayes, I owe you an apology." Madeline raised an eyebrow, surprised by this unexpected admission. "I told your father hiring a woman would be trouble," Frank continued, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "And I've been saying you weren't strong enough for this work since he passed. Today proved me wrong on both counts." His honesty touched her. "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. That means a great deal coming from you." Frank glanced toward where Xavier was organizing the night watch. "Irwin's a good man," he said, the words seeming to cost him some effort. "Better than most who have passed through the Rocking H." Madeline followed his gaze, a small smile playing at her lips. "Yes, he is. Your father would have approved," Frank added quietly, settling his hat back on his head. "Not that you need my opinion on the matter." With that, he walked away, leaving Madeline to marvel at how near disaster had accomplished what weeks of hard work had not, earning Frank Donnelly's respect. That night, as the camp settled into an exhausted slumber, Madeline sat beside the fire, unable to sleep despite her physical fatigue. The events of the day replayed in her mind: the terror of the flood, the desperate rescue, the moment she realized she loved Xavier. "You should be resting." Xavier's voice came softly from behind her as he approached the fire. "It's been a long day." "My mind won't quiet," she admitted as he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Too much happened today." Xavier nodded, understanding without need for explanation. "You earned something important out there. The men saw what you're made of, what I've seen all along." Frank apologized, Madeline said, still slightly amazed by the fact. "He actually admitted I was strong enough for this work." A smile curved Xavier's lips. "He'd be a fool not to after watching you ride back for Jimmy without hesitation." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the crackling fire and distant lowing of settling cattle the only sounds. "I was terrified when I saw you in the flood's path," Xavier finally said, his voice low and intense. "In that moment, I realized how much you've come to mean to me, Madeline." She turned to face him, the firelight dancing across his features. "And what have I come to mean to you, Xavier Irwin?" He took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Everything," he answered simply. "You've come to mean everything." The honesty in his voice took her breath away. Despite the impropriety, despite the watchful eyes of the camp around them, Madeline leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, pouring into the kiss all the emotions she couldn't yet put into words. When they parted, both breathing quickly, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "When we reach Tucson," he murmured, "when this drive is over and the ranch is secure, we need to talk about the future." "Our future," Madeline clarified, her heart beating rapidly. "If you want there to be one," Xavier replied, uncertainty flickering briefly in his eyes. Madeline smiled, a genuine, uncomplicated smile that lit her entire face. "I do," she whispered. "I very much do." Morning brought clearer skies and the welcome news that the pass ahead, while still muddy, appeared passable. After a quick breakfast, the drive resumed, the cattle moving more cautiously but steadily through the aftermath of the flood. The mood among the men had changed noticeably. Where before there had been skepticism about following a woman's lead, now there was a quiet respect. Madeline found herself the recipient of respectful nods, and even the occasional smile as she rode among them. Frank, true to his change of heart, proved an invaluable ally during the remaining days of the journey, offering advice without attempting to override her decisions and backing her authority, when some of the more traditional hands hesitated. Xavier remained a constant presence at her side, their growing feelings for each other becoming an open secret among the men, though they maintained professional decorum during the working day. 8 days after leaving the Rocking H, the drive reached Tucson without further major incident. The cattle were in good condition despite their ordeal, and Madeline was able to negotiate a price that exceeded even her father's best deals in previous years. "The buyers were impressed by our timing, despite the flood," she told Xavier as they watched the cattle being counted and transferred to the buyers holding pens. "Apparently the other ranches are still at least 3 days out." "Your decision to take the Western Pass paid off," Xavier acknowledged with a proud smile. Madeline shook her head. "Our decision. I couldn't have done any of this alone." As the last of the cattle were tallied and payment was secured, a sense of accomplishment washed over Madeline. She had saved her father's ranch. She had proven herself capable in a world that doubted her, and she had found something she never expected to find: love in the midst of struggle. That evening, after settling accounts and ensuring the men had proper accommodations in town, Madeline and Xavier walked together through Tucson's plaza, enjoying the relative civilization after weeks on the trail. "I've been thinking," Xavier said as they strolled beneath the cottonwood trees that lined the square, "about what happens when we return to the Rocking H." Madeline looked up at him, curious. "What about it?" Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "I came to your ranch looking for work, Madeline. I never expected to find a home or my heart." Her breath caught at the sincerity in his voice. "Xavier, I know it's sudden," he continued, taking her hands in his. "We've known each other only a short time. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." To Madeline's astonishment, Xavier dropped to one knee right there in the plaza, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by. "Madeline Hayes, you are the strongest, most determined, most remarkable woman I have ever known. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Madeline's eyes as joy welled up within her. The proper response would be to ask for time to consider, to point out that they had known each other only weeks, to worry about how quickly their feelings had developed. Instead, she followed her heart. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, Xavier, I will." He rose to his feet, lifting her into an embrace that lifted her clear off the ground, both of them laughing with sheer happiness as he spun her around. When he set her down, his expression grew more serious. "I want you to know," he said earnestly, "that I don't expect to take over the ranch. It's yours, Madeline. I would be proud to work alongside you as your husband, not above you as your boss." His understanding of how important this was to her only confirmed the rightness of her decision. "We'll run it together," she promised. "Partners in every sense." Their return to the Rocking H 3 days later was met with celebration from the ranch hands who had remained behind. Mrs. Garcia, upon hearing their engagement news, immediately began planning a feast to honor the occasion, her joy for Madeline evident in her tear-filled eyes and warm embrace. "Your father would be so happy," she told Madeline as they sat in the kitchen later that evening. "He always worried about you being alone after he was gone." "I thought I needed to prove I could manage alone," Madeline admitted, watching as Mrs. Garcia kneaded dough for the next day's bread. "I was so focused on showing everyone I was strong enough that I nearly missed something wonderful." Mrs. Garcia smiled knowingly. "The strongest people know when to accept help, Nina, and love is the greatest strength of all." 2 weeks later, on a perfect autumn day with the Arizona sky stretching endlessly blue above them, Madeline and Xavier were married in a simple ceremony on the Rocking H. The entire ranch turned out for the occasion, even Frank Donnelly looking pleased as he stood among the guests. his usual stern expression softened by the festivities. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch decorated with wildflowers, Madeline thought of how far she had come since those first difficult days after her father's death. She had fought to save her inheritance, had proven her strength in ways she never imagined, and had found a love she hadn't been looking for. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and Xavier's kiss was a promise of all that lay ahead: partnership, respect, adventure, and love. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with ranch hands and townspeople alike dancing and feasting under the stars. As Madeline and Xavier shared their first dance as husband and wife, she caught sight of Frank speaking with Samuel Wilson from the bank, both men watching the newlyweds with approving expressions. "Looks like you've won over your last critics," Xavier murmured, following her gaze. Madeline smiled, leaning into his embrace. "It wasn't about winning them over. It was about earning their respect." "And you have," Xavier affirmed, his eyes filled with admiration as he looked at his bride. "You've earned the respect of every person on this ranch, Madeline Irwin." The new name sent a thrill through her, another tangible sign of how her life had transformed. "I like the sound of that," she confessed. "So do I," Xavier agreed, spinning her gently as the music continued. "Though I've been thinking about the ranch name," he explained. "The Rocking H was your father's legacy. I think it should remain that way." Madeline considered this, touched by his thoughtfulness. "My father built this place from nothing. He would want it to continue to grow." She looked up at her husband, a decision forming. "What about the Rocking H.I.? Hayes Irwin, our legacy together." Xavier's smile was answer enough, but he added, "I think that's perfect. A new beginning built on a strong foundation." Later that night, as the party wound down and guests began to depart, Frank approached the couple, hat in hand. "Congratulations to you both," he said sincerely. "Miss Hayes, Mrs. Irwin, now, I suppose I want you to know I'm proud to work for you, both of you." "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly," Madeline replied warmly. "That means a great deal to us." After Frank had moved away, Xavier pulled Madeline close, speaking softly into her ear. "Remember the day we first met, when Frank said you weren't strong enough?" Madeline nodded, the memory no longer painful. "And you said I was stronger than all of you." "I knew it then," Xavier murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. "But you've proven it 100 times over since." "We're stronger together," Madeline corrected him, turning in his arms to face him fully. "That's what I've learned these past months." As the stars shone brilliantly overhead and the last of the lanterns flickered around the ranch yard, Xavier kissed his wife with all the love in his heart. "Together, then," he agreed. "Always." Spring came early to Bisbee the following year, bringing with it new calves, green grass, and the news that Madeline was expecting their first child. The Rocking H.I. flourished under their joint management, with Xavier's innovative ranching techniques complementing Madeline's head for business. Frank remained their foreman, his loyalty now unquestioned, and the ranch's reputation grew throughout the territory as one of the best managed operations in Arizona. On a warm May afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the ranch hands work in the distance, Madeline took Xavier's hand and placed it over her growing belly. "He's kicking," she said with a smile. Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Awful certain for someone who insisted we wait to be surprised." Madeline laughed, the sound carrying on the spring breeze. "Call it a mother's intuition, though I'd be just as happy with a daughter." "Either way," Xavier said, his expression tender as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "This child will grow up knowing his or her mother is the strongest person in Arizona territory." Madeline leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, contentment washing over her. "And knowing that strength comes in many forms," she added softly, "including the strength to open your heart even when it seems risky." As they sat together, watching the life they had built continue to flourish around them, Madeline thought of how far she had come from that day when Frank declared she wasn't strong enough. The journey had been difficult, with dangers and doubts at every turn, but she wouldn't change a moment of it. Because that journey had led her here to a thriving ranch, a loving husband, and the promise of a family to carry their legacy forward. To a life filled with the kind of strength that mattered most, the courage to face challenges, the wisdom to accept help when needed, and the capacity to love without reservation. In the end, that was the greatest strength of all.